Okay, Dr. Gambone is an author and professor of history at Kutztown University. In 1999, he received a Fulbright to serve as lecturer in American history at the Japan Women's University. I got this not from what you sent, but from another. Where are we? And he is a veteran of the 82nd Airborne Division. In 2006, he deployed to Iraq as a Department of Army contractor and served in the city of Mosul. Welcome, Dr. Gambone.
All right. Well, thank you. We always have to struggle with AV at the beginning of every class. That's basically a rule. I'll give you some extra background. When I was hired at Kutztown, my area was supposed to be Latin American history. And partly because back in the old days, my job from Fort Bragg was to invade Nicaragua. So I spent most of my grad years studying that. And that was my preparation. Now, a lot changed 8 years ago when I started teaching a class on conspiracies. The reason I did, my mentor at Penn State and I had lunch, and she mentioned she was doing it. And I said, oh, that'd be nice. That'd be kind of neat. And this whole thing started as a lark, basically, not knowing any way, shape, or form where it was going to go. So a nice thing to do became a really necessary thing to do, I think. So I've been teaching this class. I'll be doing it this spring. I usually have about 140 students enroll in it. And I tell them from day one, it's a trap. It's a Trojan horse. I'm going to trick them into learning research methods, which is what the whole thing's for. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is taken directly from the class. And we can have questions at the end, but if you're bursting, please interrupt. That's fine. No problem with that at all. Actually, that's my favorite part when I do these things, is just to kind of get engaged with you guys and see what you think. So let's start at the beginning. I actually have some notes. Let's start with the what and definitions. So when I teach this, I always try to make a difference between what is a conspiracy and what is a conspiracy theory. All right, that's important to understand. Conspiracies are pretty straightforward. You look at the textbook definition, it's an action taken by a group because you need more than one person. It's an action that is usually harmful or illegal or immoral. Right? I have a lot of criminal justice majors who understand exactly what I'm talking about. And in my class, I actually talk about a lot of crimes, right? Because that's what a lot of these things become when they're real. Not hard to understand. If you break down the Watergate break-in, there are multiple crimes. I always like to list the number of felonies before I ask a student to identify them. If you look at 9/11, there are crimes involved. There are criminal enterprises, right? And so on. If you're following the news and the latest court revelations, you have laundry lists of crimes, right? So all that's part of this. People try to stretch that definition a little bit to say, well, people commit conspiracies every day. What about the surprise birthday party? Well, yes and no. Usually you want to make sure there's a surprise, but I haven't been to too many that want to inflict harm. I mean, my birthday's coming up, so, So yeah, we tell white lies, and this is probably larger than just the things I started with, but now get into conspiracy theories. I'll take a quote from one of my favorite historians. Her name is Catherine Olmsted. She wrote a very good book called Real Enemies. She teaches at University of California. I actually met her last year when I was in California doing a panel on this. I like the way she puts this. A conspiracy theory is a proposal about a conspiracy that may or may not be true. It has yet to be proven. All right? So academics, I think, take the right approach. What might seem nonsense today might change in a year or 10 or 40. It just depends on what the evidence brings you, right? And that's what you have to wait for. And that's what you have to be patient about. And that's a problem because this is not a patient country. All right? So we'll actually get into that a little bit. So that's how I try to approach it with my students. And in general, you wait to see if the evidence matches the claim, right? It's interesting if you even look at the term conspiracy theory. There's a conspiracy about that. A lot of people are going to say it was invented by the CIA back in the 60s to try to figure out ways to undercut the Kennedy assassination schools of thought. If you research the phrase, you can actually find it right after World War II, right? So you can debunk a theory about the definition of the theory, and on we go. But a couple authors have done that, and I just point that out because even the terminology can be controversial. Okay? If you look at the when in this story, if you're looking at timelines, are we unique? We're absolutely not. Absolutely not. I mean, if I research and I write about this, you could see the Federalists and Anti-Federalists going at it, hook and tongue, about the French malfeasance in the 1790s trying to influence our election, right? You could go back to the Black Death. You could go back to the Roman Empire. These things are as old as we are, right? So the timeline's long. It's extensive. It's continuous. A lot of these themes keep reoccurring. When I teach the class, I start with the protocols of the elders of Zion. Some of these ideas get resurrected with different labels, right? The international Jew is now George Soros. We just use different code words today, but for the exact same meaning. But it's an old story, okay? Where is this? It's global, okay? You're going to find this throughout the world. Depends on what topic you look at, but you could find 9/11 conspiracy theories in France as well as here. You have QAnon in Japan as well as here. If you've ever heard of something called the Sovereign Citizens Movement, it's global, right? So it's not like Americans have a lock on this. We don't, although there are certain parts of this country's culture that seem to facilitate it more so than other places, right? So look at the polling data, almost any source you can possibly imagine. You'd be amazed at the frequency of these beliefs in the general public. Everything from Barack Obama is the Antichrist, and I think one poll I looked at said 6% of people believe that. It's higher than the people who think that there are lizards running Buckingham Palace. So,
But smaller than the number who think Elvis is alive?
That's a good question. I don't know if Elvis made it into the poll since everybody knows he's already alive. So, I'm just kidding. All right. The last two things I like to look at are, the how and why. So, how do these things exist? How do they develop? Michael Barkin wrote a really good series of books on this, and I liked his word. He used folklore as a way to understand how this stuff appears. In oral history, hand to mouth, we pass these stories along. And again, if you look at historically, this is how it's learned and becomes ingrained. And then it evolved. And this becomes a story where it steps outside of my field, and we talk about media studies, right? We start with the print media, and you can see that as far back as you could say where you're looking at examples of the Illuminati, right? 18th century. That's going to carry into the 19th century, same thing. The penny press is going to carry it forward. You'll see New York Times editorials about this in 1900, right? In the pamphleteering of the time period. The printed written word is what's going to transfer this. You move to radio. I mean, the War of the Worlds broadcast is an interesting little touchstone for this idea of paranoia in American society that Orson Welles tapped into, I think, mistakenly or maybe deliberately. Television's just going to add another layer, right? You get to the modern day, the studies of this are fascinating. I saw the mention of Naomi Klein. She has a really good book on this. The fact that she's constantly being mistaken for Naomi Wolf. Doppelganger is a great book. And it's a very good deep dive into this idea of what the internet has done for this story and how it's changed it and magnified it. One of the things I like about her book and others is the word curated, right? Because you have internet, and we all know the terms, influencers, whose job it is really not to tell the truth, but to curate information, to project it into the public domain for a lot of different reasons, all right? I mean, the term I learned early in this process was clickbait. Whatever gets your finger to click that button to lead you to the next ad, okay? All that's going to matter because this has become a process of influencers who go way beyond the traditional versions of that. I mean, when I was a kid, you listened to a congressman or a congresswoman, that's an influencer. Now that could be somebody giving you diet tips on TikTok, okay? But what we're starting to see here is this very crowded domain of people like this, right? Who matter. And it's interesting, at this year's campaign, I noticed this on both sides, especially on the Democratic side, You're bringing a lot of these people right into the political dialogue because they know that's how you connect with a young audience, right? Because folks like us are not the mainstream anymore. We're looking back. I mean, I actually buy newspapers, and I ask my students if they've even seen one, and they can't tell me what that is, right? They know podcasts, they know YouTube channels, they know TikTok, right? So the influencer is going to be part of how this is done. But there's another part here, and I like to mess around with this whenever I'm online. It's the algorithm, right? So if you've ever bought something online and then jump back into, say, your Facebook page, what you just bought is going to appear there, right? And I used to do this just to screw with the algorithm. I'd go on Amazon and buy Korean spices, and then I'd buy a book about zombies, and to see what the algorithm was going to try to do with that, right? And that's how you know. I mean, you have software that's everywhere that's tracking you and tabulating because they want to market, right? And again, this is a more sophisticated version of what we've been doing for decades, but it's really effective in messaging. So a lot of the good scholarship is pointing out the fact that the influencer plus the algorithm is boosting these messages because they attract people, not because they're true, and not because they're researched or valid, but because they attract clicks and views and likes and subscribes. And this has become almost like a third party in this story. And this was before AI. AI's just made it easier to do. But this is what's governing a lot of what we see as information. And that's the hard part, because people like me have to be deliberate and take our time and explain. And we get lost in that cascade. It's really hard. There's a great term I learned while I was teaching this class. It's called the Gish Gallop. And it's a debating technique. You just keep asking questions and positing things, and you just overwhelm the other guy where he can't possibly keep up, and you're controlling the narrative. You're not informing anything, you're just controlling it. That's what the algorithm does now. That thing that's producing memes is going to outpace the ability to debunk them or explain them. And I've run across that constantly. Sometimes I'm on my Facebook page, and I see some of the dumbest things I could possibly imagine. I said, I better reply to that. And I'll look it up, and I'll do my due diligence. And by the time I post a response, there's 5 more memes that have been posted. So it's almost like a war of intellectual attrition, right, when you look at just the sheer mass involved. The how in this is really important to the present day for those reasons. Okay. How am I doing for time? I'm always checking. All right, the last thing. Why do people do this? So I started as a historian, and before you knew it, I'm teaching a class, and I'm using another book I'd highly recommend. It's by a guy named Rob Brotherton. It's called Suspicious Minds. He's a clinical psychologist. All right, so when I'm teaching students to answer the question why, I have to go beyond my field. What motivates people to do this? Why are they doing this? How does it possibly happen when this rabbit hole gets constructed and they get sucked into it, right? Brotherton's interesting, because if you look at this psychologically, you're looking at 2 parts of the brain, right? The brain stem that we have, that we've always had, is very suspicious about everything for the sake of survival. We're always worried about that thing. We're always wary to a point, right? That's an old behavior that's never going to leave, right? That survival instinct. So when it comes to challenges to anything that we have, we're automatically going to question it, be suspicious, be skeptical. It's natural, right? And a lot of this is subconsciously part of the way we think, and we don't control it. I mean, his point is that sometimes your subconscious takes you out for a ride. It's a reflex, right? Another part of what he talked about, again, psychologically, we don't like messy things. We like order. We try to impose them as best we can, and the easier we can do that, the better for us, or so we think. So there's an old experiment called the messy desk test, where you could have somebody sitting down who instinctively wants this thing to be put back into order, and it's going to affect what they perceive, right? Think about the modern day and age where things are spiraling out of control, and somehow you want to impose order back onto it so you can have a sense of being in charge. What you're giving yourself is agency, right? And that is a huge attraction to a lot of these beliefs where you can be back in charge. So it's maybe a combination of the current day challenges and maybe this old nostalgia. You know, and I hear that a lot. Don't you remember back when you were a kid? I said, what do you mean, before the polio vaccine? What are you telling me, right? We're curating our own past to try to come back to it. We do this. Okay? Brotherton's a good read. Another way to look at this, because I have a whole chapter on QAnon, right, in the book I wrote. We like crusades. No, both of my in-laws are PhDs. I had a really interesting early couple years of my marriage. I felt like a PhD defense every time I went to Thanksgiving. But my mother-in-law said, you know, we're kind of a Puritan nation from the beginning. In some respects, we still are. We like the idea of being on top of some type of moral order. We like the fact that we're going to provide remedies for evil. We always seek that out. And when you think about it, that's a very good trait. Right? I'm talking about World War II and its impact on the civil rights movement and highlighting disparities that are obvious that we need to fix. We're compelled to because we're good people. That trickles into all these stories too, right? And when you think about why a QAnon believer is motivated, well, we're going to help the children. We're going to fix a problem. It doesn't matter if it's not there. All right, you've all probably heard of the Comet Ping Pong Pizza story. We've got a child slavery ring apparently in the basement of a pizza parlor in the Washington Beltway. Well, there's no basement, first of all, and there was no child slavery ring. Right? It's the same thing with the furniture company that people keep thinking is selling children and not furniture. People want to help children. That's the main motive. Right? That's the reason why you have yoga groups that become kind of these bastions of QAnon, because you have mothers who want to help children. We like crusades. Right? We like the idea that we are possessors of special ability and knowledge to reach out, to be the evangelical, the missionary, the fixer of things. All these are hugely attractive. And it gives you grounding again between right and wrong and good and evil. The world can become black and white. And again, beyond the psychology of this, there's a lot of these beliefs are a matter of faith. Like it or not, they are. And you're going to see the catchphrases come out all the time in these discussions. When you look at, that side being bad, existentially evil, we've got to fix our country. If you look at any of the imagery of January 6th, there are QAnon people there. And you can see it in their merch and their poster art and their protest signs. It's right there in plain sight if you're looking at what motivates this, right? So I'm just picking on two things right now. You got the psychology of it, the faith of it. Okay? One thing I'll throw in, the why. Scapegoating is a very useful tool, right? And again, this is an election year. It's a matter of politics, but we know how this works. We create scapegoats in the political domain because it's a good way to motivate people to do things. I covered this during the first Red Scare in 1919, when people were talking about A. Mitchell Palmer being the next president. This was the story of Joe McCarthy in 1950, when people talked about him running, right? The Southern strategy, I heard that term pop up. Yeah, that goes back to the 40s, and Barry Goldwater actually tinkered with that in 1964, right? Nixon understood it really well. If you can find some lightning rod to create, you're going to mobilize people. I mean, how long have we been talking about nativism in politics and treatments of immigrants? I show my students pictures of how Italians are depicted in 1909. It's the same as now, right? We just picked a different group. But it's a good way to mobilize and influence and, to be honest, to manipulate, because that is what we do. Right? When we want that red meat thrown to the base to get them to move. Right? We could try it with class or race or ethnicity or gender, but it's useful. Please, I saw you.
Preying on ignorance. That's what I'm hearing. They're preying on ignorance. Why are we so ignorant? Why are we gullible? This always drives me insane.
Yeah.
If something is terrible, it's terrible in the essence of it.
Well, I had a student ask me this because I have education majors, and they asked me the question because that's what they want to know. It's like, how do we teach our way out of this? How do we inform our way and bring people to, rationality and light? And we have to try. I mean, that's why I keep responding to those stupid memes on Facebook. I'll say, I'll send a link, and here's the data. The Bureau of Labor Statistics is going to be probably better than a picture of Ted Cruz yelling, right? I'm always going to try that approach. But I think what I also have to tell people is that at some point we're not talking about an intellectual exchange. We're talking about an emotion and an emotional response. And it's overwhelming, that ability to do what you're talking about. I think that happens a lot. And I don't think anybody's immune necessarily. Yeah, please.
That emotion comes from the lack of understanding that this is not true, which is back, it's like a loop, right? Back to ignorance again. And ignorance is not stupidity, it's just not being informed on something. Now, if you're asking people to put in labor, forget it.
Well, I'm a teacher. I do that every day. Did you read the syllabus? I mean, how many times have I asked that? But we're our own filter, I guess, and whatever that filter is being constructed as, it could be a facilitator or a barrier, is kind of how I look at that. Please.
So Tony's focused on lack of knowledge, and you've responded by focusing on education, information. To some extent, isn't this human nature or even primal?
I think a lot of it's, like I said, that's Brotherton's point. I mean, we always have that root suspicion. It's part of the brainstem. It's part of how we're going to try to protect ourselves. It's instinctive. So I think everybody has that to a point. Right? How much I'll put it to you this way. We know how thick the civilization veneer is until all the power goes out, right? And then
we go to Cancun.
Well, I know your reference. Yeah. But, I mean, I remember when Hurricane Sandy hit, South Jersey, and people were ready to shoot each other over a gallon of gas.
Yes.
I mean, it's not a thick veneer. Having been overseas, I could see people living like that every day. And, yeah, I mean, we're lucky in some ways. We can have that pretense. But once it's gone. So I'm lucky because I teach inside a building. The building nominally has air conditioning. We are relatively comfortable. And we can have discussions about this. I'm really lucky about that. That's my job. And they're not a captive audience, but, thinking is part of what I'm hoping they do. Different places, different circumstances. I mean, it just depends. It's not a matter of, saying it's wrong. It's just you have to be persistent and maybe find different ways to communicate. I mentioned when I wrote, this is why I like John Oliver so much. He makes you laugh long enough to learn something. I mean, how many of those shows I've laughed my way into understanding something I didn't know before? And that's approach, how do you get the guard down? I mean, so it's kind of that infotainment approach, and you make sure that 51% of it is information. That's one way. I mean, how many kids in this generation learned everything they know about politics through Jon Stewart, right? Because he goes on those rants, but by God, you're learning something, right? So you kind of let your hair down a little, per se. It's not a good pun for me today, but so be it, to be accessible. And I think in terms of pedagogy, I'm a lot different than the GI Bill professors I had at Penn State. Those guys were just scary, right? Somebody who landed at Normandy wasn't interested in asking questions, during class. He just told you what you needed to know. It's a very different environment today, and some reasons I think are very good. So, and I've been trying to do that. I'm the old guy now. I've been teaching 31 years. So, I had a case study for you, and I wanted to maybe offer that out, and we'll just open it up to everybody. I got lots of these. I like the stuff about the hurricane in North Carolina because I wrote a chapter on chemtrails. And this idea of weather manipulation goes back for decades. Somebody actually thinks up in Alaska there's this giant antenna farm that's doing it all. And it was actually an Air Force experiment on ultra-high frequency communications. But, it looks futuristic, so it must be weather control. It's not. One of the people who promotes a lot of this is named Dane Wigington. So he has a gigantic following, actually, that really does believe that when we look up and see contrails, that it's actually aerial spraying to change the Earth's, everything. And it could be a FEMA project or not. My students don't like that because my environmental science majors go crazy when I start bringing it up. So I've set that one aside. The one I really like, though, is I like the Gulf of Tonkin incident. That's one of my favorites. Because when I talk about this stuff, you could say it's crazy, ridiculous. A lot of it's not, right? Now, some of you guys know very well, 1964, you have two clashes at sea off the coast of North Vietnam, August. It's August 2nd, August 4th. They're very different because one definitely happened, right? August 2nd, you have U.S. naval units clash with the North Vietnamese. Now, almost from the very beginning, there's stories being spun. These were innocent ships at a random patrol, international waters, victims of North Vietnamese aggression. Well, none of that's really true, right? You have U.S. ships that are monitoring communications while there are being raids on the coastline of North Vietnam by a separate unit that one destroyer had no knowledge of. But we're interfering with the country. We're technically in a state of war. All right, so denial's part of the official story from day one. But this happened because it's clear, it's bright day. You've got aircrafts who see everything. You've got a very important figure in history named James Stockdale who overflew this and witnessed it all. It happened, right? 2 days later, one of the same ships is at sea, further out, because they're trying to avoid this, and a firefight ensues. But it's nighttime. The weather's terrible. Radar signatures are all over the place because weather has a way of interfering with technology, like it always does. So this massive firefight breaks out. Same pilot's overflying this. Stockdale's overflying this, and he said, well, the only thing I saw that night was black water and American firepower. This goes back to Washington. There's a basic decision made, and the guy who made it was Robert McNamara, who said, no, this happened. And we're going to tell the public that this was a second unprovoked attack. We go to Congress. We ask for a vote. None of this information is being explained or described in any detail, because there isn't any. But Lyndon Johnson gets the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. We go to war. Right? He gets a blank check if you read that thing. That's going to determine the next decade of history and beyond. Right? And it's a decision that's based in part on a lie. Okay? It's a conspiracy. Right? Harm did come from this. They knew full well that some of these things never happened. Now, what I tell my classes, and this is an important way to look at this, how do we know that? And this is where patience becomes the problem, because some of this information isn't going to be declassified for 40 years. McNamara is going to die, and eventually we're going to have access to his records. The Lyndon Johnson Library is going to release some of them. The NSA, who keeps a close hold on this stuff with a death grip, is not going to declassify some of these messages until 2005, right? And now you've got a much better picture of what happened, and you also have a damning indictment on the people who knew. I mean, some of these sources are phone transcripts of McNamara and Johnson talking. Yeah, this didn't happen, we know, right? And full well, they lied. They lied not just to the people in '64, but to Senate committees for years after this, right? And I walk the kids through this, and part of what I tell them is that conspiracy theory might become a conspiracy fact, but the evidence has to follow somehow. And that goes back to what Olmsted said. It has yet to be proved. Well, in this case, it has. And you've got an interesting, kind of generation of scholars, and one of them is H.R. McMaster. Yeah, the guy's he's at Stanford now, by way of, the Trump White House and the U.S. Army. Right? He's actually a really good historian, and I respect his work, but he is incredibly damning about his evaluation of this, because the stakes were very high, and there were agendas at work, and public officials acted on them.
But wasn't one of the agendas to beat the commies? Wasn't that a good goal in their planning, that it's okay to lie because that'll get us the forces we need to beat the commies?
In the days of containment, the ends justified the means. Right.
It just sounds very similar to weapons of mass destruction.
I cover 9/11 and official intelligence reporting on that and what it meant. Yeah, I was there. I mean, I was. So the parsing. When David Kay went to Iraq and said, well, they don't have an active program. It was dormant, which means they had the centrifuges and the technology, but they were all disassembled and scattered around the country. There was no imminent threat, but words matter. Right? You have the quote-unquote terrorist training base, at Salman Pak, which DIA and CIA later said didn't exist. Right? So it's interesting when the government starts debunking the government after 9/11, because they were being held, with this bag to say, well, you guys told us, and they didn't. I mean, a lot of this stuff was being distorted and misrepresented. You're right, it's very similar. Whether it's Tenet or McNamara or whatever administration, Yeah, actually, when I talk about 9/11, there are like three sets of parallel conspiracy theories at work here, because one of them was official, but it fed into the other ones. And that's always the problem for people like me. A lot of these have kernels of truth in them, somewhere, right? Government malfeasance or bad practices or, I mean, all I have to do is tell my students, Tuskegee experiment, right? And they, you know, it's an easy story to tell because Seymour Hersh told it 50 years ago when those revelations came out. Sometimes there is a kernel of truth. I mean, the Air Force was experimenting with weather control, just like they were with the atom and everything else you could think of for applied science. That doesn't mean they came up with anything, but they were looking at it. Because again, the Cold War. So that's what you always have to be embedded somewhere in this, is a recognition of that kernel of truth. Dismissing it outright might be a mistake, because you never know what might come back to get you.
How did Colin Powell get talked into, you know, because it's just, if anybody would be a thinker.
Yeah.
So what do you think?
That's
Pressure from the administration? Or?
I have that picture of him with the bottle. Well, it's not anthrax. I mean, he's holding it up. There's no way they're going to let a guy in the UN with anthrax. It's probably baking soda. But it always comes down to how much ambition is going to outweigh judgment. And I look at his career, and he was moving up. I mean, there were plans. And the man does have integrity, but it's not, you know, it didn't have a rock solid grip on his career. And we know how this goes. And what are you willing to sacrifice for the next step? I think that's partly why he did it. And it ruined him. I mean, it ruined his career. He could have run for president. He did, you know, but it ruined him. I mean, all the revelations that came about that. So that's the best answer I have for you. Please.
Is this boiling down to character? Is this boiling down to an individual's ability to, you know, not acquiesce to bullshit? I mean, personal bullshit.
So we love saying the phrase, it's important to tell truth to power, right?
But if you are the power, I'm saying there has to be somebody at the top
Yeah.
that's acquiescing to themselves and giving into this.
I like the point about the Cold War. You have an existential threat. What do you have to sacrifice in order to ensure? There's a lot of ways to rationalize that at the top tier. There's other ways that aren't defensible. That's the best way I can put it. I mean, it does come down to integrity at some points. But how many people? I always think of Jimmy Carter. I mean, you have a president who's going to deliver bad news, and he did. And you know that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you know, this is the problem, right? I mean, this is what we have. But, I'm sorry? Well, what bothers me, though, is that, I mean, you've seen in the last 4 years a lot of revisions about January 6th. It's astounding. I mean, people literally running for their lives who are going to lie about it and still do it. I mean, to say, you saw this in the debate. There was a peaceful transition of power, apparently. Yeah, that's technically true, but I mean, and a Jesuit would be proud of that answer, but we know better. They weren't tourists. No, I have a laundry list of the number of police injured in January 6th, and they know that. There's actually a Virginia State Police newsletter. A Virginia State trooper was attacked with a 12-pound sledgehammer during this riot. People usually don't bring sledgehammers to tourist events. I mean, that's a rule of thumb. But, and we know the Dominion voting system's court records, you know, what transpired at, you know, Fox News. These people full knowing. So that's been encouraging to me to see how the courts have been one of the best assets we have in this story, because when you go to court, you're compelled to present evidence, right? And we know how this worked in 2020 with lawsuits, and we know what happened to all the affidavits that people filed once they faced perjury charges. So courts are a great way to test character because there's penalties, right? That's important. It used to be that you'd lose your reputation for being irresponsible, but that's not necessarily true anymore. You just get a different sponsor. I mean, how many people went from Fox to Newsmax or OAN? It's like this declining scale of media credibility, but they're there. I guess it comes down to what penalties we assign, right? I have to keep mine in front of my class because, if I start off with this nonsense, I'm going to lose credentials, credibility, maybe tenure from that. And faculty have done that. I mean, there's examples. A guy named James Tracy in Florida lost his job because he was monetizing a lie about Sandy Hook, and he got caught. I have another faculty from University of Minnesota. He was promoting the book "Nobody Died at Sandy Hook," right? Yeah. I have my students read one of his chapters and dissect it because he doesn't have any sources, right? And they're furious that somebody like me could be that irresponsible. I said, yeah, we're not immune, but who brings the consequence? It could be the courts, it could be us. So that's a long-winded response, but
What would you,
please.
what would you say to someone, a young person who's not in college? I know people like this who say, like, they want to be knowledgeable about what's going on, but they'll say something like, "Oh, there's just no way to figure out what's true and false anymore." What would you tell them?
So I apply the old rules. There's another really good book called Rescuing Socrates. It's actually written by a Columbia College professor. Logic works, right? You offer a claim, you have to provide a proof, right? I draw that on the board. Claim, proof. There's always got to be that link. And then you can get into your sources, right? And you know as well as I that the single source argument is going to be weak. You're going to build it on a pedestal. You're going to test that evidence. So we talk about multi-causal theories, right? And multiple layers of evidence and cross-indexing evidence. So the class I teach is kind of the lead edge into that practice. Say, you got to assess what you have, you got to test it, you got to compare it, you look for continuity.
Okay, what if this person was basically getting most of their information from social media,
Right.
YouTube, and they're just like overwhelmed and just want to throw up their hand? What do you?
Then my job is to teach an 18-year-old patience, right? And that's hard. Like, slow down and give yourself time to think. Yeah, but that's part of it too, because that algorithm's just going to feed you the next video, and I've banned phones and laptops in my classes, actually. They're not allowed any technology anymore. I use blue books. They have to write with their hands. And they're like, they look at a blue book like I just landed in the middle of like Brazil in the rainforest. But I go back to the old ways because that's, slow down and think. And I have midterms this week. But yeah, I'm fighting against a pretty significant opponent with that damn, cell phone. But
Your students need to write
oh yeah,
and
Yes.
answer the midterms.
yes, yeah, just like I did. Yeah.
Is there conflict? Can you talk about within the students, between themselves? Is there conflict?
So, I'm not done with your question because it's a really good one. So I have kids in my class who don't think Sandy Hook happened, and they absolutely believe that. So, Kutztown's a different school because it's a state college and it's more blue collar than a lot of other places. It's kind of like Penn State when I went there. You don't have a lot of ideological clashes constantly, but I let people talk because, again, I'm not going to shut down something just for the sake of saying it, but I'm going to ask follow-ups. Where'd you get that? How do you understand that? One of the things I've done in this class was I used to have group projects where I'd have groups of students advocate a conspiracy, and then I'd have another group debunk the exact same conspiracy. And we're talking about evidence, but we're also talking about a civil discourse, where I'm the moderator. And it's like, all right, well, let's talk. And that's exactly how we did it. There's no screaming. There's no endless thread of insults that come down on like you've seen them. So that's my job. I'm the moderator, right? And I'm going to make sure I set the tone. And that's something else you want to do. I'm not going to be a punching bag, but everybody's going to get their say, and then we're going to talk about why do you think that? Where'd that come from? So, they're going to say, well, I found this on TikTok. I said, well, was there a citation? And I know there wasn't. You know, I love that thing, citation needed. Put a little asterisk next to it, right? Yeah. Find me where you got that. I always say, bring that back to me and show me, and then we'll deconstruct that. So that's what I want to do. I want to unpeel that one moment. But I'm trying to teach them civility, and that's, you know, that's ongoing. But I'm not going to let them scream and shout. You know, I'm like the bulwark against it, I guess, but that's what teachers do these days. You set the tone. Yeah, and they're going to tolerate or not, but that's the key word, is tolerate means to not agree. It's to tolerate, and maybe that's the starting point. So is that making any sense? Or I only have 30 or 40 more years of teaching left in me, so we'll see how it goes. I'll be 120 years old by the time I get it right. Maybe. So, yes, sir.
So tell us about your work in Nicaragua. You were a PhD researcher for the DOD?
So,
Or how did that construct?
early version of me back in the Reagan years, I was a lieutenant in the 82nd Airborne. I was in an infantry battalion, and I was the medical platoon leader. So our area of operations was going to be, they never said Nicaragua, but it was Nicaragua. We were going to liberate Nicaragua from the Sandinista government. I did my work as an undergrad on Vietnam, and I thought, well, this is sounding familiar. And a lot of Vietnam veterans were always saying, yeah, the down south looks a lot like it did in South Vietnam. Red clay and hilltops, and so we were ready to go constantly. I mean, Reagan was going to deploy, you know, almost at least every year, if not more. So I wanted them to learn more. Why? So I dug into the Somoza years, ended up writing a book about it. And I wanted to learn. I mean, like I said, I was curious. Like, why was I going to war? I mean, I had the benefit of being able to do that after the fact. So I did. Yeah, it was good.
Just the fact you were in the military. I thought you were a civilian.
Now, later on in Iraq, I went over. Yeah, that was a different capacity. Yeah, so. Yeah, I have a way of turning up in different places. Yeah, I spent 1 year, I was in Managua and Baghdad in the same year. So, yeah. It's a good experience. I'm glad I did, because I got to see firsthand the way things were, at least from my, you know, that little perspective. So, yes, sir.
So looking to the future, what tools do you see that we can leverage to kind of get the best information acted upon, you know, both at the local level as well as global level? Because it seems like that's really the critical path to guiding our society to a forward, you know, position.
So it's really encouraging to see how responses have evolved with this problem. It's like I became a very early member of a website. It's called Metabunk, right? And it's enormous. It covers virtually any possible thing you could think about relating to conspiracies ever. And it's moderated. It requires research. And it became a really important reference point for me, you know, as I went through it. Because I joined it eventually. Teachers groups have formed exactly the same type of, you know, resources. You're seeing these things spread. There's a very good podcast called Conspirituality where they talk about this stuff and it'll deconstruct it. So there are more tools, I think. So we're catching, you know, things have caught up. You have ways to reference this. So the information's there. Then it becomes, you know, how do you present it? I mean, how are you going to try to do this? That's become part of clinical psychology too. I mean, I'm reviewing a book right now about QAnon belief as a pathology. And I'm reading this thing, I keep thinking about the 1970s when everyone was worried about their kids joining cults and having to deprogram them. I mean, there's a lot of similarities in that. So this has actually moved into, you know, the social sciences. So lay people have resources, professionals are trying to catch up. There are plenty of places to look. I mean, it depends on what you exactly need. I don't know if that's answering your question.
And do you see a place for AI and algorithms, you know, if programmed and taught, you know, sufficiently, they can be the tools that help us defeat the, you know, the ones that are encouraging information and disinformation?
It's possible.
How else that we can, you know, fight that complexity that's involved in the information space?
Well, and the tempo. I think that's the other part, because it just human beings can't keep pace. No, I've gotten flagged on Facebook for debunking memes, but all the AI saw was the meme. and then I got flagged for disinformation. So they don't read text, but yeah, maybe someday. That's a possibility. I mean, that'd be good. That'd be a good use of AI, as opposed to them doing take-home homework for my kids. Yeah, which I've run across. But please.
My opinion on Michael Smerconish. He's a Philadelphia political commentator. One of my right-leaning friends said, subscribe to this guy's newsletter, and at least this is the way it's presented. You get one email a day. Smerconish gives you links to 20 news articles that he thinks might be of interest. But the concept is that if they're as neutral as anything can be, so are they going to be biased? Yes, but they're supposed to be middle of the road things? Something like that help, or am I just reading Smerconish and not seeing the bias?
So there's Rene DiResta, worked at Stanford until very recently, and that's, academic, high-end academic, think tanks have done this idea with specific issues, especially things like election fraud, where they send out press releases that are almost the same pace, where they're trying to counterbalance. So it's a great idea.
And it seems to me that we need to get this in digestible bites, because otherwise it's completely overwhelming.
It's true. But it comes down to what you prioritize. What issue really hits you the hardest? For me right now, it's the election. But it's a problem of too much information. It's the old military intelligence problem of being over, the fire hose. You're stuck in front of it. So you can go with issue-specific sources like Stanford University or Smerconish. But even that, if you're going to have to filter those 20 down to the thing that you can focus on at the moment.
I'm very selective.
Yeah. No, the other problem that does, that Stanford nonprofit got sued out of existence by other conservative groups. So she actually lost her job this summer. She published a really good book about it and other things. But yeah, she was a great source. She was also one being claimed, in front of the House that she was part of the global network of, censorship. She never was. But yeah, litigation's become another problem for these. These moderate groups. So yeah, that kind of worries me. But the tools are there. I guess it comes down to time, like we have copious free time. Yeah. Sundays, if I weren't doing this, I'd be grading for sure. That's what I do right after waffles. So yeah. Anyway, that's a great point. Anybody else?
Money. Can a billionaire do something? Can a billionaire who decides to...
They can do anything.
Doing it all the time.
Yeah.
Well, that's manipulation. This isn't manipulation. I'm hearing you want knowledge to be broadcast, available, digestible. Is there a billionaire that could aid this?
I have to think there is. But it comes down to the message, but how you're going to frame the messenger, right? Every well-meaning billionaire out there has tried this, and it could be the Koch brothers or it could be George Soros, but it's interesting when we talk about solutions here. Is it top down? Is it bottom up? And I think the organic part of this is going to be the best recourse, because I might have my favorite billionaire. I never really thought about it that way, but the self-motivated, informed citizen. At the bottom of that story, that's what I'm trying to do with my 18 and 19-year-olds, to say before you get you dive into the throes of this melee. Here's some things to maybe, hang on to, maybe one or two facts or one or two methods, and that helps you down the line, right? And I also tell them, I said, volunteer to work at the polling place, because that's where you see this stuff happen. And I worked my work into my class. I said, there's a big difference between fraud and an irregularity, right? Because how many American voters actually know how to vote, right? Or I've had how many people with that ballot that they think is a receipt, and they're going to walk out with it. And I'm like, I haven't tackled anybody yet and brought them back into the polling place, but I've, fold it up, stick it in your wallet. All right, I'm done. No, you're not. You just literally disenfranchised yourself. Well, what do you mean? That I'm not putting it into that vote shredder. I would love to have kids being exposed to that experience just to see how this all works, because it's dependent on how many thousands of volunteers who are doing their level best to decipher these binders, right? And with these procedures. I'm looking at you because you and I are going to be the same guys on November. That's how I'd love to have, experience teach these kids, and I've had them. I've had the high school kids come into there and work, and it's a good day. So, because God knows I'm getting too old for this shit, like the old detectives always say.
You hear those conspiracy theories from people.
Yeah.
Ideas, and they don't know who they're talking to. In my case, I work in construction, and I hear these stories going around, and I'm going, well, that's impossible. That can't. And they're insistent explaining to them. I've been working at the polls for many, many years.
Yeah.
I'm telling you the facts here, and eventually they won't stop what they believe, but they back down once you put a firewall in front of them.
Lycoming County did a hand recount of the 2020 election, right? Trump won it by double digits, but they wanted to do it anyway. 60,000 votes. So I think 12 changed for Biden, or 12 for Trump, 8 for Biden. 20 votes changed out of 60,000, which is the margin of error, which everyone always talks about. That's what I always tell people. I said, yeah, that sometimes there is a mistake. It's not by design, right? It's a mistake. But the number is so incredibly small, right? That's normal. I mean, the Brennan Center did a study of 1 billion ballots stretching over decades and came up with this incredibly small error number. And weirdly enough, the Heritage Center published that, right? So sometimes there is agreement between nonpartisan and partisan, but there's only so much that reasoning's going to get, right? When you got the guy who looks like he's a wrestler trying to have you watch a YouTube video while he's voting. And I've had guys like that too. They look like Randy Macho Man Savage with their gear. And they want me to watch the video. I was like, just for the love of God, go in that polling, just vote. I don't care how you vote, just get it done. And it will be counted. There's a limit to how much you can do, but you got to try. I mean, that's what I'm like Charlie Brown with the football. That's what this is like. A lot of this is like, right? You just keep going. You keep going. And one of these days, so.
I'm very interested in like the psychology involved with all of this and what we were talking about.
You'd like that book.
Yeah. What we were talking about in the beginning about people need order and structure, and I get that.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that, like, we're talking about these election conspiracies, that's not order, that's chaos, right? So there seems to be, like, they just get this idea in their head, or they hear it so often. It's like I tell people frequently, just because it's said over and over again doesn't make it true, But it just, I think a lot of this leads to chaos, and I don't see the order coming out of it. It's just interesting.
No, it's not fraud unless our side wins. I mean, that's like that weird argument you're hearing in real time now. That's what I keep saying. There's a limit to reason, as far as you can take it. And sometimes it's not going to be enough to explain what's going on. We are a bundle of contradictions sometimes. Yeah, I mean, I'm married 34 years. Right? I'm a dog person, my wife's a cat person, so we compromised. We've had cats for 34 years. See what I'm saying? I love those cats, especially when one of them woke me up at 4 a.m. So, yeah, go ahead.
So would you see religious belief on the spectrum of conspiracy theory? And, I mean, I just wonder if, to some degree, our society, at least the religious-leaning side of it, has been kind of encouraged to believe outrageous things and get that dopamine hit for the expectations. That certainly seems like a potential, example.
There's been a lot of really good work on Christian nationalism. And I think the problem is not to conflate that with Christianity. I mean, because they're different. But this idea that you've got, the Protestant versus the Catholic, right? You could look at the Populist Party 140 years ago, regaling the country about the plague of locusts that Italian Catholics will bring in case we make it there and somehow get entrenched. Well, that was my family. But that's always going to be a device, that moral suasion that has structure, but it can be warped, right, easily to a purpose. And I think that's what we're seeing too much of. I mean, it's faith without compassion, if you want to look at it that way. It's faith without mercy. It's faith based on grievance. And faith can be warped, and that's a problem, but it's not a common denominator among everybody who believes, but it's a vulnerability. I mean, I'll put it that way. I mean, I could find better ways to be more controversial with all this, but no, I think that's how I look at it, at least.
It seems like the simple belief in an afterlife is so outrageous, but it's a benefit. So like to a degree, the brain wants to, maybe grab onto that. And again, evolutionarily, we probably have been, kind of, again, evolved to kind of want things that benefit us. And so, I don't know, that just seems like built into our nature, and we have to, figure out a way to, build our way out of it to some degree.
So when I talk about World War I, and I talk about the nativist backlash that the war generated, and I always say there was always a fine line between being a patriot and being a vigilante. And you always have that crossover point. And I think it's the same thing. I could be a faithful Christian, but I could also become a vigilante. And where does that, inflection point begin? That's always what I look for and wait for. When it starts moving into the scapegoating, blaming, assigning of, evil. And that's where it moves out of balance. It's the old, life out of balance. I think you see it over and over again. And that's what you try to guard against. Take a breath, think about what you're about to do. It's hard. Yeah. We do it all day. We do it every day, all of us. So.
We used to be more tolerant of each other, and this seems to be boiling down to intolerance. Or am I reading the past with rose-colored glasses? We could have political differences, but now we can't. It seems like things are very rigid.
Self-restraint used to be what you didn't talk about at Thanksgiving dinner. Using our inside voices. Yeah. Whatever breaks there used to be on that as a culture. I always look at, this is where I kind of agree with you. The people at the top, we got tired of politicians telling us nothing, but at least they weren't trying to cause harm, in some cases, but influencers come from a lot of places. It could be our pastor, it could be our congressman, it could be a lot of different people. That self-restraint isn't what it used to be, I think. I joke about it, but faculty didn't curse in class, right? Sometimes I do, just to get their attention, just to to rip them out of their fugue. But when I was not when I was a kid, that never happened. But the standards always shift, and not always for the better. Yeah, but that's a hard thing to get your hands around. But it's kind of, you can see it, but it's hard to really get a grip on it. Yeah, I think you're right. Just every time I have meetings like this, it always comes down to, what's wrong with these damn kids? It always comes down to the same question. I could be talking about NATO, and they'd want to know about, what's wrong with these kids? Why are they always, vaping? Like, we were just talking about NATO. But yeah. I do my best. My link with an 18-year-old is getting more and more distant. Yeah, I can't see the board. Why don't you move? This is that's what I just did this week. So yeah, get up and sit here. I feel like I'm at Boys Town. I'm like Father Flanagan some days. Yeah, it's funny that you know that reference. They don't. All right. I think we're at time.
Any last questions?
Nobody
Great.
runs the stage. That's good.
Well, thank you very much. We enjoyed.
Thank you.
So. And of course, we'll be back here next month. I think it is Ted Schick.